Papa, why are there so many kinds of evaluation? Because evaluators bring with them different values. Why? Because they are trained differently. Why? Because they have different interests. Why? You really want to know why? Yes, yes, yes. Okay, I'll tell you the short story version. Once upon a time, as humans evolved, they began creating things, like the wheel, and deciding that some things they created were good and some things were bad. And so humans became evaluators. Some things they created were both good and bad, like fire, depending on how they were used. So they had to figure out when to use it for good and when it was bad. Humans created problems, and then they figured out ways to solve the problems using evaluative thinking. And then, as the problems grew, they created something called programs to solve those problems, and stakeholders to support those programs, and evaluators to evaluate those programs. And evaluation became a profession. And it began determining what was working and what was not working, and reporting that to people in power, who mostly ignored what they told them. But as more thinking went into how to do evaluation and how to get it used, more approaches to evaluation were developed, and pretty soon there were lots and lots and lots of evaluation approaches. And that's how we got so many kinds of evaluation. Well, this is a brief explanation, for those of you who've stayed with this, of the panorama of evaluation approaches, a separate video I did that listed over 101 evaluation options and counting. That video opened with Dr. Seuss's story of Mrs. McCabe, who had 23 sons, and she named them all Dave. And when she wanted one and called out, "Yoo-hoo, come into the house, Dave," all 23 sons of hers came on the run. And that set up the different names for kinds of evaluation. In this video, I'm going to share 23 groupings of kinds of evaluation, because after the panorama video came out, I got emails and queries saying people felt overwhelmed by the number of choices and couldn't they be grouped together in some more manageable way, and asking why were there so many different kinds. So this is the brief explanation of why there are so many kinds. There's a longer video I've done, nearly an hour long, that explains in depth the different groupings, but this is the brief overview version. So we begin with what is to be evaluated. There are product evaluations, personnel evaluations. This video focuses on program and project evaluation. And then there are variations in the location and role of the evaluator. Independent offices, consultants, internal evaluations, and external evaluations. What were called euphemistically sometimes outhouse evaluation. But the real difference in kinds of evaluation come from different values. The word value is in the middle of evaluation, and we bring values to bear in evaluating projects and programs, but values also distinguish different approaches to evaluation. So we're going to apply values-centered evaluation to 10 competing and alternative paradigm evaluation perspectives. beginning with those that seek definitive answers versus those that honor diverse perspectives. Those seeking definitive answers ask, does the program work? Those honoring diverse perspectives ask a different question. What are the perceptions of what works for whom, in what ways, under what conditions? An example is the Strategic Impact Evaluation Fund, which seeks definitive answers by using experimental methods like randomized controlled trials that estimate the impact and cost effectiveness of government and nonprofit programs. In contrast, Seville Kushner advocates personalizing evaluation, looking at the diverse individuals who participate in programs and understanding the program through their unique stories. Those are two different perspectives on the role of evaluation. A second contrast is between those who advocate that evaluators render independent judgments versus those who are engaged with co-creation through participatory evaluations. Michael Scriven famously said, "Bad is bad and good is good, and it is the job of evaluators to decide which is which." That puts the evaluator in the role of rendering judgments. In contrast, the co-creation approach is to work collaboratively with participatory and empowerment forms of evaluation to co-create evaluations. Quite different approaches. A third distinction is between evaluations that simply aim to describe outcomes versus those that aim to explain outcomes. So, for example, performance measurement approaches describe what level of outcomes were attained, while theory-driven evaluation aims to explain those outcomes. Competing purposes for evaluation distinguish accountability versus learning as one major form of different evaluation purposes. And these different purposes compete. It's different to prove a program is effective than to improve it. To be held accountable for whether the program is appropriately spending money and achieving expected outcomes is different than learning about what works and doesn't work in an environment where people feel safe to talk about failures. Those in accountability environments are often afraid that failure will lead to negative consequences for them. And so while many talk about doing both accountability and learning, there are tensions between those competing purposes. Another distinction is between those evaluations that aim to get what are called scalable best practice models versus those that emphasize adapting evaluations culturally and contextually, being culturally responsive, so that those that are working to find replicable and scalable models that have merit and worth, merit in that they've been judged to work and worth in that they can be used in other places, do fidelity evaluation to ensure that the evaluations that are replicated are in fact true to the original model. Whereas the Center for Culturally Responsive Evaluation and related approaches work to adapt evaluations to different cultural and situational contexts. A sixth distinction is how much emphasis is placed upon use. The traditional social science approaches to evaluation emphasize methodological rigor, validity, reliability, generalizability, replicability as the criteria for high-quality evaluation, whereas utilization-focused evaluation emphasizes use as the primary characteristic of a high-quality evaluation. Both are interested in use tests and truth tests. The difference is where the emphasis is placed. A seventh differentiation is project-level thinking versus systems-level thinking. In the last decade, we've moved from simply evaluating projects to beginning to do program evaluation with logic models and SMART goals, but now are being asked to look at systems change and systems transformation. And these differentiate different approaches to evaluation. An eighth approach is how much a command and control approach operates versus complexity and uncertainty approaches, so that the traditional approach to planning, implementation, and evaluation of projects and programs is plan your work, work your plan, make your plan work. But increasingly, we're faced with turbulent, complex, dynamic systems changes where complexity concepts come into play and being asked to evaluate in the face of uncertainty. So traditional command and control approaches to evaluation are quite different than agile, flexible, developmental, and complexity-based approaches to evaluation. Now, a ninth differentiation is viewing evaluation as neutrally technical versus viewing evaluation as inherently values-based. The standardized and universal OEC DAC criteria are viewed as neutral criteria that can be applied to any kind of evaluation as technical criteria. In contrast, those who are oriented towards social justice approaches to evaluation explicitly make values part of what they bring to the evaluation work that they do. Feminist evaluation is values-based. And finally, there is the view of evaluation as neutral, informing decisions, providing information, but being above the fray, versus evaluation as part of the intervention and engaging in change itself. So that standardized approaches in large international agencies like results-based management is focused on being neutral, independent, and objective, while the approaches of the activist, interventionist change-committed evaluations aim to make evaluation part of the change process, to incite and foment change, decolonizing evaluation, transforming evaluation to evaluate transformation where evaluators have skin in the game. These, then, are the differentiations of values-based evaluation that explain why there are so many approaches. We begin with what's to be evaluated and where the evaluation is located, then those that seek definitive answers versus those that seek multiple perspectives, evaluations that render independent judgment versus those that are participatory with co-creation, those that primarily describe what goals have been attained versus those that explain how and why those goals have been attained or not, those that focus on accountability versus those that focus on learning. Then there are the evaluations that seek to generalize best practice models compared to those that emphasize contextualization and culturally responsiveness. Evaluations that take a technical view of the work versus those that see the work as values-driven. Command and control approaches to evaluation versus complexity and adaptive approaches. Project-focused evaluation versus systems-focused evaluation. And validity-focused evaluations versus utilization-focused evaluations. These different kinds of evaluations culminate in evaluation viewed as independent and neutral versus evaluation as intervention to foment and facilitate transformation. And that is why there are so many approaches to evaluation. Wow! And do they fight each other? They don't fight, but they do debate. And dialogue and discuss. And evaluators compete in courting funders, which you'll learn about all too soon. But that's the story of why there are so many evaluation options. What's next for evaluators? Well, there's a lot of trouble facing humanity. There's pessimism about whether things are going to just get worse, but there are good things happening and some optimism, and evaluators are trying to sort out what's going well and what's not going well. But your generation will determine the future. And young and emerging evaluators imagine new possibilities. The end.